Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Index podcast. My name is Stefan Tornquist, and I'm the lead author of the Global Workplace Happiness Report. For the next couple of months, I'm going to be taking over the podcast host chair from Matt Phelan to interview the academics and experts who are contributing to the report. I'm in New York, where I have it on good authority, minus 12 Celsius. Um, and I am kept warm by my excitement for our guest today. Dr. Amanda Henwood has been good enough to contribute an essay about clarity and its role in the workforce. Amanda is a practicing behavioral scientist, and she's going to start by telling us what that is. Welcome, Amanda.
Hello, nice to see you. So that's a common thing that I get asked. It's one of those awkward party questions where most people's job fits into a very neat box where you can just respond with two words, ideally. But ours is a bit more complex, so we always have to do a little bit of explaining. So, a behavioral scientist, what that means in practice is. So I work with a team of about 15 applied behavioral scientists at a company called Influence at Work. And we typically help clients to resolve any sort of behavioral challenges. So the work is really varied. It could be a public sector client trying to, let's say, change a behavior. We've worked on issues as varying as domestic abuse. We've looked at speeding. We've also worked with kind of lots of commercial organizations on things like increasing communications impact. So yeah, very varied. Anything that involves trying to change behavior or mindsets, we can help and advise on.
Is absolutely fascinating. And I'm really going to try to avoid, like, I would love to find out speeding. That sounds like a fascinating problem to tackle. But we'll stick to workplace issues anyway, and the role of clarity. For a bit of context, in the survey that is the basis for this benchmarking report, we look at clarity in three different ways. So we ask sort of how clear are people around the requirements for their job, how well does the organization keep them informed, and then how clear is the role between or the link between their role and the success of the organization. So that together is sort of our clarity lens. And I think most of us might instinctively know what clarity means in sort of lay terms, but what are the components of clarity specifically in the workplace?
So I think clarity, it can show up in various ways within the workplace, but there are some key areas, let's say, that are really important to focus on, and there's been quite a bit of research on. So one of those is role clarity. So when people feel really clear about what it is they have to do in their role at work, that can have really positive knock-on consequences for pretty much all of the workplace outcomes you would like to measure. I think one of the most impactful ways of getting that role clarity to have an impact in your organization is actually to train it in your leaders first. So typically what you find is actually when you have clarity in the leadership team, that clarity will trickle down throughout the organization. And so that then has a knock-on effect to the employees too. So employees will then be clearer about what needs to happen, and therefore the process of actually getting there and doing the thing becomes a lot easier. So that's one really important area, is role clarity. I think another key area for clarity is actually connecting that individual role clarity to the broader organizational goals and values, as you say. So typically, you can think of clarity both at the individual level and the organizational level. But unless you have a connection between those two kind of silos, then people will not be able to see how their everyday behaviors actually feed into those broader organizational goals, which actually are the things that give people purpose and meaning in their everyday activities. So I think it's really important to actually be able to connect those two areas as well.
Hmm. Uh, b- Going back to your description of what you do every day, how often is clarity part of the mix of what you're addressing?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of organizations actually on role definition specifically. So we've worked with organizations to develop very clear frameworks that clearly spell out what kind of skills are expected, let's say, of the leadership team in a big organization. And that's much more than just giving a broad kind of overview of the different skills, but it's actually breaking down those skills into very specific behaviors. So you might have the overall skill of, being creative and having a forward thinking mind. But to really be clear in that approach, you need to understand, what does that look like in a behavior that I'm going to be carrying out in my workplace day to day. So that might, as a behavior, look like, you are contributing 3 ideas each time you have a company team meeting, let's say. So it's really being clear about what are the details that you need to be able to actually live that skill and embody the trait that's desired.
Hmm. Uh, so I could imagine at some organizations, there's when someone's job when a job description is written, there's often a fair bit of work that goes into that. And I've certainly seen how that is the last bit of work that is ever done around that job description, or mapping when it gets down to sort of, okay, now here's this person and they're reporting to that person. That person really taking that job description and making it a living thing with metrics and, opportunities for feedback. It does not happen every time.
Yeah, you're right. I think the issue there is often that the criteria that they've outlined for the job don't necessarily always match up with how they're being assessed when it comes to performance reviews, when it comes to kind of 360 internal reviews. So I think also, as an organization, you need to match up your training schemes to that as well, because people can't get to point B if you're not showing them the route from point A. So I think you've got 3 things there. You've got, one, making sure that training actually maps on to those key skills and key role requirements that you've outlined. But then 2, if we're not judging success or evaluating success upon that same criteria when it comes to promotions and reviews, then people aren't incentivized to do it. So you've kind of got to link up those 3 things.
Hmm. So, well, taking a step back, what are the let's start with, what are the personal costs of having a lack of clarity, being in an organization that is, because I know clarity can come, or the lack thereof can be at different levels. What's the effect on the individual?
So I think a lack of clarity, well, basically, it shows up in the brain, actually, a lack of clarity as a threat. So if you were to put a brain under a scanner and actually put someone in an unclear situation, what you'd see is the threat response in their brain light up really large. And that means a few things. So, one of the main things it means is that your body will go into a state of avoidance. So typically we have either a tendency to approach or avoid things in our environment, and threat is one of the things that triggers avoidance. So that's not a great scenario for workplaces, because once you have avoidance, you see a more disengaged workforce. You find that people are less able to just get on with the task. So you might experience more procrastination. Perhaps you find it difficult to ask questions because you're unclear about the parameters in the first place and you don't want to kind of embarrass yourself in a situation. So I think, yeah, it's just one of the main personal costs is really this second guessing yourself all the time. So you can get into a state where you're always having to predict the outcome when the outcomes aren't very clear, or the process to getting to those outcomes aren't clear. So once we're forced to actually predict what the next step is or possibly is, we well, that's actually the recipe for anxiety, right? So anxiety is a disorder that's actually born from uncertainty and having to predict every next thing. So it's less about the negative consequences, but more about just, we don't know what's going to happen next. Therefore, our brain is going into overdrive trying to work that out. And of course, that reduces focus on the main tasks at hand. You can't be as productive as you might otherwise be. But there's also a real personal cost of just that doesn't feel good. You feel just, maybe you even question your role at work, you question your organizational fit, and all of those things can contribute to much broader issues, like, lack of loyalty to your organization, or, the willingness to actually up and leave your job because you don't feel that connection. So the knock-on effect is pretty big.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've been at organizations that went through, and worked with organizations that have gone through either a big change management
Hmm.
effort, or or an acquisition, a merger. being, sold off for parts, all of which they're inherently stressful, right? Because um, even the clearest organization doesn't quite have all of the answers to every conceivable question. Um, but you can see it's interesting because sometimes you'll see productivity even increase under certain circumstances, but it's the productivity using yesterday's sort of measures. People are,
Hmm.
they're worried like, well, once this merger goes through, there will be some kind of restructuring. I would like to have the option to be on the other side of that restructuring.
Hmm.
Um, and so they do what's familiar. It's part of that fear response is, well, then I'm going to do the heck out of these three things that I'm comfortable doing or I think are being perceived, um, which is which is fine if you're going through sort of a financial downtick, perhaps, but almost always antithetical if you're going through some big change. If you're trying to we're moving from being a traditional organization to a digital first organization.
Hmm.
You don't want everybody, "Oh, I'm terrified, and I'm going to double down on my traditional activities?" Um, so did we in talking about the effect of a lack of clarity on people, did we miss anything in terms of its effect upstream on the organization?
Well, I think firstly you talked briefly there about the impact on productivity potentially being good in the short term or through some measures, and I think you're right. It does have. I mean, the research supports that it has an impact. Often, stress can have an impact that's good in the short term. It helps to narrow our focus and can increase engagement. But when you see that pattern replicate over time, that's when it starts to lead into these destructive avoidance patterns. Um, and in terms of the broader organizational consequences to that, I think you're going to get low morale across the organization. Teams are going to start to be impacted. One of the big consequences to lack of clarity for organizations at that kind of broader level is actually lack of trust. And once you start to get lack of trust in leadership and even colleagues, that can really break things down because teamwork then suffers. You've also got people just not knowing in which direction they're heading, and it all just becomes quite chaotic. So clarity really helps to kind of cut through some of that chaos and give people a clear path.
Mhm. I would think it would have real implications for well, to preface this, I think it's true that people feel fairly comfortable and clear within their own teams because, they've got interpersonal bonds and, a managerial relationship. Might not be a great one, but at least they sort of have a sense in this group of 20 or however many people, I sort of know my place in it and so forth. But so much of modern business asks us to work cross-functionally. And I would think that's where a lack of clarity. I mean, I don't think um, it, I've encountered a lot of lack of clarity in watching teams try to work together.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I guess one of the main issues there is oftentimes you've got a different language that's spoken by,
Mhm.
let's say, different departments or different disciplines. And so I suppose what clarity can help to do in that situation is create this idea of a shared understanding or a shared language. So if you've got some way of allowing individuals to come together but speaking a shared language. Perhaps you have a facilitator for those group meetings that helps to kind of align teams. There are various kind of practical interventions you could do as an organization to try and help with that, I think. But you're right. I think as soon as you've got different languages being spoken, then it becomes much harder to reach that kind of shared understanding that's necessary for clarity to take place.
Mhm. Yeah, I think very often you'll see, well, we want these teams to work together on X, but this team's measured on, the number of lines of code they produce in the course of a month. And this team is measured on how quickly they can get deals signed. And very often the KPIs are actually in conflict. And, there's some old management chestnut about, for every measure you have a silo, and that, there's some truth to that. If we're measured differently, it's very hard to come to a, clear consensus.
Yeah, so I suppose what you would need in that sort of situation is an overarching company goal, maybe to align people. You may have different metrics within the different departments or disciplines, but actually, if those metrics are feeding into the same outcome or the same overarching goal, I think that can really help to align people. So it's important for organizations to actually come together, at the C-suite level and decide what are those things, and not just decide what are they and have them known among the leadership team, but also communicate that transparently down so that people understand, one, what those shared outcomes are, but also how their different individual metrics feed into that overarching goal.
Hmm. Um, all right. So going back to, you talked about the most sort of common manifestation, let's say lack of clarity is questions around how job description and translate to reality, or
Hmm.
the job requirements, not just job description.
Yeah.
So at another level, we ask, how well does your organization keep you informed?
Mm.
And that's a very tricky thing for a company that's going through any sort of important change. When things are just ticking along, I suspect our requirements for information are probably lower. We don't think about, well, what does the future hold?
Hmm.
So what happens when you are working with a company and they say, well, people are people are confused, or they don't know where we're headed, but honestly we can't tell them everything because then they'll all go running for the door, or what? How do you walk that line?
Well, I think the response to not tell them everything is probably the right one. So, especially in crisis situations, people want information. That's true, and they want honest information, but they don't necessarily need all of the information, right? Especially, we live in such a information rich world that's just getting ever increasing with the likes of AI and so many different tools that just, yeah, just being on the internet or being having all these different communication channels at work. Like, you've got Teams chats popping up, you've probably got Outlook emails, whatever it is. There's just so much information that we have to consume these days, and I think it gets even more when you look at the increase of hybrid working, for example. But I think, yeah, it's, I suppose, yeah, just trying to think through whether or not, I think the research suggests that the key is actually being very targeted in that information. So there's two things that people want to know typically when they're going through a kind of chaotic situation, like a restructuring or a reorg. One of those is, you know, what is happening and why. But the second thing is that what does that mean for my role?
Yeah,
So I
what's
think,
happening to
well,
me?
exactly. How does that apply to me personally in my day to day? So organizations have a duty to come together and decide those things before they communicate the restructure. So that at the same time as communicating all of the changes happening, you're also telling people very specifically what the implications are for them, what are the personal implications, and how can they mitigate some of the negative impacts of that. So that might in practice look like kind of coaching sessions with your manager or reflection sessions. Maybe it's a kind of reorganization of some of the job criteria or assessment criteria. Maybe you come together as a team to discuss what your priorities are and how they will shift and what that means for the different kind of metrics that you might be tracking as an organization. So I think basically getting down to the specifics, but doing it in a targeted way. So people don't need to know everything, but they need to know what is happening, what was the rationale. Often people can cope a lot more easily, let's say, with negative information if they understand the process that people have taken in order to get there. So people actually prefer bad news to uncertainty,
Oh,
which is interesting.
100%.
So yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, I
and
don't need
yeah,
a,
if
a
you're delivering,
massive global survey to tell me that. I think that's
yeah, well, exactly.
manifestly
And I
true.
think you're right. And if you're delivering that kind of bad news, the best way to soften the blow is to actually explain the reasoning, because at least people then understand that there's been a thought process behind it and how people have got to the outcomes, because it resolves some of that uncertainty and some of the gaps that people will otherwise try to plug with their own mind, which, people often think of worst case scenarios when they do that, especially in crisis situations. So yeah, I
Right.
think,
A crisis can turn everyone into sort of having 3 a.m. thinking.
Yeah,
Every
that's like,
ping on one of those devices you mentioned is, bad news.
yeah.
Um, and you see, some, and this is difficult for leadership to navigate. I'm sympathetic, but you see some companies will, um, there'll be an overarching message, but then the news, this team is being downsized, this person's leaving, we're going to move this person. That always seems to matriculate sort of organically instead
Hmm.
of through any sort of official communications. And then you're in real trouble because, that the information's very often wrong and people are drawing conclusions and it can get very sticky very quickly. Um, so, in the essay, you talk about how well-being isn't just feeling good; it's sort of feeling. I think I've got the free within limits,
Hmm.
which made me think about chess and other games, where games are fun because they have rules, not because they
Hmm.
don't. Right. So, how do you know if a team has the right level of agency and freedom to make decisions effectively?
So typically, it will show up in two areas. It will show up in feelings, and it will show up in behavior to some degree. So you can ask people how clear they are about certain things, and you need to be specific, right? It's no good just asking people how clear they are at work, because that's too
Yeah.
vague. Can't do anything with that. If you can really narrow it down to, how clear are you about your role description or your job requirements? How clear are you about the promotion process or the hiring process? Um, those things can sort of help to give people or give organizations a more targeted understanding of where clarity can be improved. But in terms of the freedom, I think when you have lacking freedom or lacking sense of autonomy in your team, which is often a result of poor clarity, you will see it in the fact that people come to you with more questions. They will perhaps be asking for a lot more check ins. Perhaps they feel nervous about delivering work. They're not sure about the expectations. But on the management level, you might see it materialize as kind of micromanagement. Um, there's a desire then to manage the threat that seems very real, and they often people do that by controlling everything they can, which leads to things like micromanagement. Um, so I think there are a number of kind of small behaviors you can keep a watch out for as well to kind of detect whether these things are happening in your team and at your organization. I think reworkings of deliverables multiple times can also be symptomatic of that because there's no common standard. So people are kind of almost shooting in the dark when they're delivering on a piece of work.
It's interesting. I mean, it's a bit tough to tell whether deliverables get reworked so often now because of the collaborative nature of digital work
Right.
that how long is is the expression "how long is a piece of
String.
string"?
Yeah.
I've really thought about
Yeah.
it before, but
How
I'm like,
yeah, how
well,
many
it's
revisions is
obviously 12 and a half inches.
too many revisions, I guess.
Yeah. Um, so you talk about trust and we sort of alluded around psychological safety. There's such a they come up in every one of the lenses that we're looking at the data through.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, psychological safety specifically, like if you're
Mhm.
thinking about um, we were just talking about a sort of a traditional version of resilience, kind of just buckling down and working. Real resilience is feeling psychologically safe and, to keep working, to keep innovate, to be free to say, well, hey, this isn't working and so on. And the same for innovation. Like it's very hard to be innovative for more than, in the short term without that sense of psychological safety. So and we've already touched on this. So,
Mhm.
but the relationship between clarity and psychological safety and trust.
So I think if people have clarity, they don't have that need to kind of second guess priorities or second guess what the expectations are. And I think as a result of that, they can just feel a bit more confident that they're acting within those expected parameters, and therefore they can sort of have the space to innovate, maybe have the space to ask questions or flag risks. I think all of those things become more likely once you've got clarity, and they're all symptoms of or I suppose manifestations of psychological safety. So it's a big clarity is a big driver of that.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry,
yeah,
I didn't mean to cut you off, but in the essay, I think you were talking about that lack of having without clear criteria, that drift to the subjective even ends in sort of bias and unfairness.
it can do. Yeah, I mean, we see that a lot in the domain of hiring, actually. So there's been so much evidence on the fact that interviews are a notoriously bad way of recruiting candidates.
Yeah.
But one way to improve them is by having very clear, structured criteria before you go into those. So the reason for that is that in the absence of very clear criteria, what people tend to do is sort of default to what we call heuristics, i.e., kind of mental shortcuts that tell them whether or not this is a good candidate. And that might be something as superficial as whether they've got the same hair color as you or whether
Laughed at my
they've
jokes, like the cut of her jib. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think just clarity can sometimes help you circumvent a lot of that unfairness and bias that creeps into processes. And the same with clarity of expectations around deliverables and projects. And when you're speaking with clients, I think if you have that, then you at least know what you're being judged on. If you have clear kind of expectations of what good looks like for something, then you know exactly where that sort of target is that you're aiming for. And if you fall short of it, at least you kind of have that knowledge yourself. You can have a conversation, you can flag it. All of those things become more likely. But in the absence of clarity, none of those things are possible because you don't know. You just don't know, right?
Yeah. It's interesting, because it can't be escaped. I've been doing a lot of work around AI in different capacities, and one of the big conversations is, well, AI is going to, in the hiring process, can be biased.
Okay.
And I'm like, absolutely, it can. But let's not presuppose that human beings are not. It's sort of like saying, well, there was an accident in a self driving car. Like,
Yeah.
yes, but how many accidents were there before? So I'm not making the case for AI driven, resume reviews, but it's just funny the way we sort of compare these things. We're like, oh, if you want to find a biased thinking machine, look in the mirror. Um, and interestingly, it's the lack of clarity that is scuttling so many AI projects. That the machines are certainly worse than we are at sort of decoding, the context, and giving clarity to themselves.
Hmm.
And so let's say you were doing something like, here's a job description. We want you to look at these resumes to find the best person for it.
Hmm.
If your job description falls down in any way, then they're just going to, find, they'll take whatever that small error is and, extend it off, into the to the horizon.
Yeah, you
Uh,
almost need a partnership of them both for most things, I think. Like, it's the interaction of AI with human capability that because we can curb the extent to which AI relies on bias and they too for us, right? We can say, what are the things we've missed? What are the perspectives that we haven't taken? So I think it can be a bit of a two-way process.
100%. I mean, I think some of the most effective uses of AI are in giving ourselves clarity. Like, I do a lot of knowledge work, right? Not, classic sort of thought leadership. Oh, this will be interesting. Here's, I have this data and a narrative, and this is what's going to be interesting. Well, I fall in love with it, just like any writer falls in love with what they're doing. And it has been enormously helpful because you can't always bring in, experts at the spur of the moment and say, hey, how does this sound? What do you think of this argument? But you can get a very useful and sometimes very deep interrogation as long as you use the right prompts with the right tools and say, hammer this. Tell me what's wrong with this hypothesis. Attack this premise. It can be enormously useful, and I think certainly there are practical workplace areas for clarity where that could be the case as well. I mean,
Yeah,
have you seen managers using AI in any ways that actually help them?
So I think you're right. The whole stress testing idea is where I've seen it used most, i.e., what are the holes in this? But I think you could potentially use that clarity frame, right? What is unclear here? Take some of the clearest communications out there and compare my email against them. What can I do to improve? So I think yes, that can definitely be a useful tactic, and it's one I hadn't thought of. So yeah, it's
It
nice.
the Well, yeah, using AI as a thinking partner as opposed to offloading thinking
Hmm.
can be extremely useful. Early on, I was building personas of some colleagues and whatnot, and that actually had its uses
Hmm.
because there's um, you can become blind to the sorts of things that you see every day. So you know this other person, but actually somebody coming or something coming in from the outside and reading the email communications would say, "Well, this is a person who's very data driven. So you're always using data to make your arguments, right?" And you're like, "Oh no, actually, I almost never do that." That kind of insight can be very helpful. All right, enough about AI. Um, the um, the the effective hybrid work of fragmented work, I'll call it, because I don't know one organization apart from the ones who have just said, look, you've all got to come back in 5 days a week and have created a very unhappy workforce. um, I don't know anybody that's really sort of figured it out. So in the essay you talk about things that are informally inferred, right, instead of stated. Does geographic distance, digital distance impact those?
So instinctively, I would say yes. What are the reasons for that? The reasons for that are, I mean, I had an example of this only the other day. So I went into the office earlier this week, and what I found was, well, I was working through. We were working on a trust project, so we're actually measuring trust for an organization and coming up with some recommendations based on the insights for that company. And there are various ways you can structure the recommendations, and you could either take the lowest scoring trust area, you might take the highest scoring, and there are kind of pros and cons to doing all. But what I was able to do by just being in the office is just have a conversation with my colleagues and just say, look, what do you guys think of this? And we then turned it into kind of a brainstorm on the spot, a spontaneous brainstorm, which you can't really get online, can you? I mean, you can schedule them, but you don't get that spontaneity, and probably you wouldn't have bothered everyone to set up a specific call to do it, right? So I think
Yeah,
there are
it's
definitely some small moments like that where, yeah, you miss that with an online culture. But there are always going to be pros and cons of both, right? But I think there are definitely things you can put in place as an online organization to encourage some of that spontaneity and that reflection. Also, like supervision of other roles, like you don't typically get oversight to what your manager's conversation with their manager is, which would give you a real deep insight in the office into kind of that stage of your life which you're not at yet, perhaps. Um, but yeah, I suppose if you're going to try to construct that with an online organization, you would need to be a lot more careful and considered about how it happens. But in the office, those kinds of things happen quite organically. And
yeah.
they're all opportunities for bringing clarity, right? Clarity to what the future will look like in your role, clarity to what you might have as an output for a specific deliverable.
Yeah, it's interesting. Preliminarily, so we look at work style as we call hybrid, field, office, and so forth. And
Hmm.
preliminarily, the hybrid people typically score higher, kind of across everything. Not quite like I was sort of expecting to see a bit of a drop on collaboration, or
Interesting.
some
Okay.
some
Nice.
you know big evidence that, or even small evidence that you get one thing but you lose another.
Hmm.
Now, granted, hybrid could, in theory, be the best of both worlds. Like, hey, I get Mondays and Fridays at home to get my writing done, and then the days in the middle of the week, I get less work done, but it's good for collaboration, and so that's the ideal. At least for those organizations that are smart enough to get people in at the same time and not just have it
Yeah.
randomly
So-
spread through the week.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, the and I do think in one on one. I think digital's probably fine. It's when, when you've got a bunch of ate up heads on a screen, it gets trickier to collaborate. Although it'd be really interesting, and this we have no data here, I'm guessing. It'd be really interesting to see how different personality types find it, because I definitely have friends and colleagues who absolutely love digital meetings over in person because of
Right.
who they are. Um, so, across the bell curve, maybe there are people for whom this has been a boon to collaboration even at a group level. Uh, all right, so let's think about. Oh, go ahead. I don't want to cut
No,
you
I was
off.
just going to say, I agree. I think you've probably got people on the extremes, and then you've probably got a lot of people sitting in the middle who, for whom a high kind of hybrid where you're in some of the time at home, the other time is best. But you're definitely going to have extremes for whom a move to online is like catastrophic, and vice versa.
Yeah. Um, all right, so let's sort of wrap thinking about. You mentioned one sort of creeping sign of a lack of clarity might be, the number of revisions that a team is going through. Are there other signs, like if I'm from a manager watching us now, uh,
Mhm.
what if I wanted to diagnose how well we're doing on clarity? Where might I start?
It's a very good question, and I think definitely start by asking people directly. You can ask people how they feel. Like I said, it's important to be specific about those asks. So find out what are the specific areas where clarity can have most impact. Perhaps start with those. Um, and as I said, role clarity is a big one there. The clarity of communication is quite a big one. Depends really as an organization what you want to focus on and where your priorities are a little bit. Um, but I think, first of all, asking people how clear they feel in regard to different things, because people don't typically self-diagnose clarity is a big
I don't think
issue.
we self-diagnose most things,
Yeah, well, it's true. We have
right?
very little insight into what really drives
Well, we don't even stop
behavior.
to ask the questions very
That's
often.
true. We don't have time. It's a busy world. It's a busy
And
life
we might
these days.
not like the answer, so we just avoid it anyway.
It's true. Bury it deep. But no, I agree. I think yes, one piece of the puzzle is asking people, but also people are not always they don't always feel the psychological safety, let's say, to be honest about these things at work, because perhaps if they admit a lack of clarity in an area, that might signal a piece of information they've missed or whatever it is. So I think you have to look broader than that as well, and that would then lead to pinpointing specific behaviors. Now, it's very hard to attribute one behavior solely to clarity because I think most things have a complex combination of drivers.
Sadly true.
But there are definitely kind of common symptoms to look for. And some of those I've talked through. So, micromanagement, lots of delivery reviews and like redos. Um, I also think just people maybe going to, but this is hard to diagnose in an organization in fairness, but people going to other people for information. So, this sort of searching for information that's not there. Um, and also you would you would see a level of disengagement. So perhaps if you just have a disengaged workforce in general, it's good to explore clarity as an option. Could it be something around that that's driving this feeling? Because often clarity does result in quite low motivation and makes people disengage with things. So I think that's another big symptom.
Right, yeah, you might not be in fight or flight, you might
Mhm.
be in sort of meh, like, now I'm just getting paid and we'll see how long this
Exactly.
lasts.
Exactly. Yeah,
Um,
quiet quitting, I think they call it, where you're
right.
disengaged, but you're still there.
Um, the although I imagine people come at kind of ebb and flow, like, if you really did an ethnographic study, I think it'd probably be pretty rare that somebody's at the same level of engagement throughout their year or, um,
That's true.
you know
And, if an organization goes through change, we know that the more change an organization goes through, the lower the scores of clarity across all things become. So it is really important that if an organization goes through a big change, they take some time to reset the priorities, reset the expectations, and just be very clear in their communications about that. So I think that's another thing. It's a more objective, almost not a symptom of lacking clarity, but it's almost like you'll have that issue if you've been through lots of change. So address it preemptively or proactively.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder what the best method is for, because I think, no offense to the many business leaders who are listening, but business leaders tend to have a somewhat rosier view of something like, how clearly do people understand our mission,
Hmm.
right? Or our strategy? Like, do people know when to say yes or no to something because it goes to our original strategy for this year or this quarter or
Hmm.
whatever? When I've done research around this, the answers from leadership, all well, I'm not going to say almost always, 100% of the time have been higher than people at the practitioner level.
Hmm.
Like, which makes sense. Like, practitioners don't sit around thinking about the strategy for days and days, don't spend any time with McKinsey and whiteboards. They're just sort of like, okay, now I um but by the going back to your point around, are people comfortable to share? Yeah, I'm not sure that the strategy really has matriculated down into my day to day.
Yeah,
Um,
I think, well, that brings up a really important point, I think, which is the importance of nudges along the way to redirect people to clarity. Because you could have all the clear information in the world. You could have spent loads of time as an organization kind of constructing different process documents and, role descriptions. But if people you show them to them once, life
yeah,
gets in the way, right? Thing priorities move on.
everybody loves an intranet.
Thinking about as much as you've put a lot of time into it, people aren't going to keep thinking about that. So unless you schedule kind of frequent reminders of where to find that information, um, I think it will get lost, right? So it's one thing being clear, it's another thing reminding people of where that clear information is.
That's a great point. And as we're getting on in time, I think it's a perfect point to jump off and ask a more fun question,
Mhm.
which is, what's making you happy?
This is funny because I came on a podcast before with Matt and he asked me the same question. And at that point, I mean, my answer hasn't changed. It still remains music and the people close to me. Um, but there's a new one that comes into play a lot in the wintertime, which is being warm. We've recently moved from
I mean, that's pretty low on Maslow's
it's pretty low,
pyramid.
but
Like, that's where, like, I
but you've got to
really,
satisfy
eating
the
makes
first
me
order
happy.
concerns to be happy, right? And this is a big first order concern for me. So it's not a laughing matter. But yeah, we moved from a terraced house to kind of an exposed house with no insulation. So I mean, this will get better as we invest in the heating, but for now we are freezing.
Ah, being cold all the time is not great.
Not great, especially for
Uh,
me. I'm not a cold loving person. So I'm looking forward to summer, although I think we're a long way, a long way from it. Although you said you're in minus degrees right now, right?
Right now,
Which
New York's going through a very, very cold stretch right now. We just had a foot of snow the other day, and now it's not getting above 0 C for the next 10 days, and not even getting close.
wait, I've picked the wrong person to complain of.
I do have quite a few recommendations offline for how to stay warm, like practical house stuff. All right. Well, before we let you go, tell us what's on your horizon. What are you working on, thinking about, excited for?
So I touched on we've developed a trust measure at our company, and that's been a really exciting project 'cause we've kind of developed it from scratch, and we're now looking at ways to improve it, and we've got lots of companies using it and diagnosing their trust levels and seeing how that relates to kind of different organizational outcomes for them. So that's really exciting, and as we continue to develop that, I'm leading that project. So yeah, very very excited to work on that, and it
Yeah.
links a lot into the subjects we talked about today. So I feel quite passionate about that.
Well, that's great. Um, well, Amanda, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your essay. I think we'll be seeing you in London at the end of March,
Yeah,
and we
and
really
that is
appreciate
also
it.
something very much that I'm looking forward to. So yeah,
Great. And thank you all for attending. Have a great day.
thank you. Bye bye.